Hi everyone, I'm Dr. SarahJilani, and you're back on The Global Gaze, where we talk art, film, and books from an international perspective. So you all may recall a past video of mine called Why What Counts as Art is Political. In that video, we had talked about how colonialism had helped shape the very category of art. How museums and Western cultural institutions had decided what counts as art, whose aesthetic expression matters, and who gets to be the universal custodians of art. So today, these debates are still live. Of course, we talked a little bit about restitution and how that remains a controversial topic. So I don't want to say that these historical origins are not at play today. But I do want to talk about in this video how we also have a slightly different landscape now in the contemporary art world. Specifically, we're going to talk about a term you may have heard of, artwashing. And I'm going to discuss it in the context of how today corporate power seeks out culture whenever it encounters crises of legitimacy. Powerful institutions, and particularly corporate power, does not turn to culture necessarily when things are going well. Let me explain that. They'll often turn to culture when public trust erodes, when their profiteering becomes difficult to disguise because the connections between them and what happens in the climate and in the geopolitics of our world are a little too obvious. And I think just as colonial expeditions were partly justified by the idea of bringing back loot and therefore making such a dangerous undertaking quite profitable, I think this idea of legitimization is one of the cornerstones of how contemporary art works and is funded today. It can move from being entertainment, education, or social critique towards image management. A museum sponsorship feels civilized. A biennial partnership feels progressive. A cultural foundation and funding it feels generous. Art appears elevated above ordinary political life, above extraction, above commerce, above violence. And for corporate power today, that perceived symbolic distance is very useful. We can take the fossil fuel industry. Over the last few decades, oil companies have faced growing public anger over climate change, environmental destruction, political corruption, and soaring energy prices. But rather than fundamentally changing the extractive systems that generate their wealth, many have invested heavily in culture. For many years, British Petrol or BP sponsored institutions like the British Museum, Tate Britain, and the Royal Opera House. Shell sponsored museums and science exhibitions. Oil wealth has funded galleries, cultural foundations, and public architecture across the world. And these relationships are usually framed as philanthropy. But much like how we discussed in that previous video, that the extraction of people's aesthetic and cultural wealth was justified by the colonial worldview, these philanthropic acts are not acts of pure generosity. These philanthropic acts are acts of reputation management. And this is where the term artwashing becomes important. Artwashing refers to the way culture can soften, obscure, or legitimize harmful forms of power. Through association with museums, exhibitions, and public culture, corporations gain access to something money alone cannot easily buy: moral credibility. An oil company no longer begins to appear merely extractive. It begins to appear thoughtful, interested, a steward of public life and art. And this kind of art washing crops up particularly when this system of profit faces a crisis of legitimacy. What I mean by that is when things aren't going swimmingly well for the vast majority of us, the system's cracks begin to show. These moments create a dangerous kind of clarity. They allow ordinary people to glimpse contradictions in the system that they are told is the best option out there for them to live a good life. I am thinking that art washing may make a decisive comeback quite soon, precisely because of these glaring contradictions that more and more of us around the world are realizing. There's an interesting parallel to be drawn here with history. Even at the height of colonialism in Europe, of course, there were those who were against either all or some of its practices for various reasons. They weren't necessarily a vocal majority, but a lot of people did not agree with colonial practices on, for instance, the basis of their faith. And so colonial plunder and loot needed to find a more legitimizing framework under which more of their own society could get behind these activities. And two convincing arguments were that there was a civilizational mission to colonial extraction and occupation, and that this would ultimately benefit, i.e., make life better for everybody. This becomes incredibly relevant when we look at how corporate power and the art world are entwined today. And museums, biennials, and art exhibitions are effective spaces for this transformation because they can carry enormous emotional and social authority. Spaces related to arts and culture often symbolize collective good, social memory, education, and progress. Just like in the colonial origins of the founding of museums, to attach yourself to arts and culture becomes attaching and aligning yourself with notions of civilization itself. Today, the mechanism is different, but the function is remarkably similar. Corporations accumulate wealth through extraction, environmental destruction, or militarized industry, and then seek legitimacy through cultural and art sponsorship. In many ways, museums today are performing one of the central functions culture has actually always performed for power and the powerful. And this is why the idea of art washing and the critique it presents is valuable and really important. And I focus particularly on oil and fossil fuel corporations in my examples for a reason. It's because in order for them to continue to survive, they really need to now rely on normalizing their practices in a world where more knowledge is widely available about their effects on climate and society. People must continue believing that concentrated wealth reflects merit, good taste, and social consciousness. Culture helps produce that emotional and symbolic environment. And perhaps that is why art institutions matter so much politically, and why art washing will not be going away anytime soon. So in this way, it's possible to actually trace many lines of continuity between colonial discourses around art and the function of culture. It's good to bear in mind if you ever encounter a kind of argument that art washing is all about a couple of people who are morally outraged about the smallest things and are disconnected from the realities of how much money it takes to run big cultural institutions. Actually, it represents a very old and lasting relationship. Thank you so much for watching The Global Gaze. I hope you found today's topic interesting. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can see all of my new videos come up directly on your feed. That's all from me for today. Thank you very much for listening and keep your gaze global.